Hello, everybody. It's good to initiate this expert insight today. My name is Julio Noriega. I am the global CEO of Executive Forums. Greetings to each and one of you who joined us today. It is a true pleasure that you have joined this expert insight about the power of the narrative, the storytelling as strategy. As you know, stories inspire and they power up values and they shape behaviors. And of course, they are the fuel behind the execution of the strategy. And of course, in this complex and uncertain world that we live today, we require leaders that can identify, build, and tell the right story, especially to connect emotionally with their stakeholders. It is with this in mind that is a true pleasure to present Massimo Martinotti, a great friend that I admire much, founder of Starlight Effect, an organization that specializes in taking the storytelling to the world of leadership and business. By the way, he recently wrote a fantastic book called The Story Hunter. So it is with all of this in mind that I am glad to present Massimo and initiate this expert insight. I hope you truly enjoy it. It is certainly very powerful. So hope you're all well. Thank you for joining. And Massimo, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Julio. I've been lucky enough to meet many of you in the last few years. I've been invited to speak at many forums in several countries, so I believe there are many friends online today. And some of you probably already heard my story, but I go into the spring into action immediately. Many years ago, there was a very large kingdom stretching from Persia to China. It was a very huge kingdom. And it was ruled by a sultan called Shahryar. Shahryar had been betrayed by his wife. And this made him think that all women will at the end betray him. So he lost faith in women. So the solution that Shahryar found was because of his wife's infidelity, was to remarry every night, only to kill his new bride at the first break of dawn. The guy in charge of finding every day a new bride for the Sultan was his vizier called Jafar. Jafar had a beautiful, smart daughter called Scheherazade. And she was said to have read thousands of books. And one day she tells her father, Dad, I want to marry the Sultan. And the father, the vizier, said, you are crazy, Scheherazade. Tomorrow you will be killed and I will be in charge of killing you. And Scheherazade says, no, don't worry, Dad, I will not be killed tomorrow. So Scheherazade married the Sultan. And that night, Scheherazade began telling a story. But of course, in the morning, when at the break of dawn, she stopped telling the story with a cliffhanger. So the the Sultan had no other option but to keep her alive for another day to let her finish the story at night. So this went on for several years, and for 1009. And the 1001st night, Sherazad said to the Sultan, said, look, I am done. I have no more story to tell you. But it was too late. I mean, the Sultan was already in love with Sherazad. He had become a wiser ruler. He had rediscovered his trust in women. So he married Sherazad. She became the queen, and everybody lived happy for the rest of their lives. So actually, Sherazad, through a story, accomplished several things: attracts and holds the attention of the Sultan, shapes his behavior, transforms him, and she got her goals. Actually, your brand or your organization, through a story, can do exactly the same thing. Can attract and hold the attention of the employees, shape their behavior, transform them, and get their goals. But the same thing the brand does with the consumers. So today, I will try to tell you briefly, because we don't have much time, and normally this presentation lasts an hour and a half or so, but now we are doing this in 30 minutes or 40 minutes. So I'm trying to concentrate in a short time a few ideas of how to a story can become a strategy to achieve several goals. Of course, to generate top of mind, which is a problem that most of the company have, to establish differentiation, especially in a time when most categories are completely commoditized, develop a powerful communication strategy, reduce costs, because of course the investment in media buying and in production is very high, and if you have the right story, you reduce your costs. Open doors and markets, boost social relevance, because a story, as we say later, is the best way to share values. Counter opposition and skepticism, and of course, align partners, investors, and collaborators. And this is basically what we are trying to talk about today. Everything began 70,000 years ago. And at the time, something happened, and it's called the cognitive revolution. What happened? Homo sapiens, at a certain point, 70,000 years ago, became to be able to talk about things he had never seen, touched, or smelled. He was able, he or she, I mean, these people living in Africa 70,000 years ago became able to talk about gods, myths, legends, and fantasies. What happened? Being able to tell stories and talk about myth and legends and gods allowed people to create larger communities. If you think that chimps can normally manage group of up to 50 members, using stories, humans were able to create much, much bigger communities, hundreds of people. And by doing so, they were able to congregate people to work together and achieve much higher goals. Before that, before the cognitive revolution, people were able just to speak about prey and predators. But when you begin talking about myth, everything changes. As I mentioned, you are able to create communities. And I give you a brief example. Before the Battle of the Thermopylae, Greece was a country made up of many small city villages that they didn't like much each other. They spoke a similar language, but they don't have very good relationships. But in the year 480 BC, a huge army came from the north, a Persian army. Herodotus said that it was composed of 1 million soldiers. But of course, it's an exaggeration. We now think that it was an army of approximately 100,000 people. Of course, a large number, a large number. And when they reached the Thermopylae, a group of 300 soldiers under the leadership of Leonidas were able to stop them a little bit, to delay their crossing of the pass, enough for the Greek army to organize themselves and eventually win the war. What happened the day after? In every single town and agora in Greece, people were talking about the deeds and the bravery of those 300 soldiers, of those 300 Greeks. And that day, Greece was born. So the story of the 300 Spartans was a powerful glue to unify this kind of very different and separated communities. Why a story is relevant for businesses today? If we look at the famous forgetting curve, we see that if we communicate through data, after 20 minutes, the listeners have lost 42% of information they have received. 24 hours later, we lost almost 70% of information. So communicating through the data is not very efficient. But of course, we all have to transmit and convey data. So how do we do it? Because at the end, we still have to tell our audience, our stakeholders, where to communicate data. How do we do it? We wrap them into emotions. We take the data and we transform them, we wrap them in emotions. These emotions are a story. The human brain works in a very funny way. After the cognitive revolution we have spoken a few minutes ago, if we communicate through data, only two things happens in the brain. Two processes, the language processes and processing and the language understanding. People understand what you are telling them and they process the information if they speak the language, and that's it. But if you use a story, many things begin to happen. First of all, the story activates the motor cortex. The motor cortex is the part of the brain involved in controlling the movements of the body. And I give you a very quick example. If you watch a movie in which a character is chased by some bandits or some bad guys, immediately your heartbeat becomes to increase. Because the story makes you feel physically the same feelings as the character of a story. The second thing is that a story stimulates the imaging processing. When you read a movie, your brain immediately imagines the face of the characters, the landscape, the interior where the situation happens. The brain immediately is pushed to imagine visually. The third thing is that story activate mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are brain cells that respond equally when we perform an action or we have a feeling, and when we witness somebody else to perform a certain action or having a certain feeling. That's why when we see somebody crying, we cry or we get sad, or when we see somebody laughing, we laugh. And that's very funny, because when we watch a movie in which there is a very sad situation, Even if we know that the actress on the screen has been paid $20 million to play that role and she's not sad at all, we nevertheless cry when we see the movie, because this kind of mirror neurons immediately get activated. And the last interesting thing is that story produces what is called narrative transportation, which means that a person, when he or she is immersed in a story, is transported to the place of the story. So if we see a movie or we read a novel set in Istanbul or in Cleopatra's Egypt, immediately we feel transported to that city or to that place and time. But there is one other thing that is produced by story. Story activate hormones and therefore emotions. Hormones produce emotions, and emotions have the ability to fix the story that had produced those emotions into a long-term memory. Emotions, of course, are produced by a cocktail of different kind of hormones and neurotransmitters that are basically activated by stories or by situations. And I give you example. This is my class when I was 7 years old. And this is me. And at that time, we had to learn by heart every week a poem. So throughout my career as a student, I probably learned by heart hundreds of poems. But after so many years, there is one I remember very, very clearly. It's a poem by an Italian poet called Giuseppe Pascoli. And this is the translation into English and says, a swallow was returning to the roof. She was killed and fell into thorns. She had an insect in her beak, the dinner of her little ones. Now she's there, as on a cross, stretching that worm to that distant sky, and in her waiting nest, in the shadow, the peeping gets fainter and fainter. Why, out of hundreds of poems, I remember this one? Because many emotions are universal. And one emotion that is absolutely universal in every culture, in every countries in the world, is the fear of losing parents. It is one of the strongest universal emotions we were born with. So it's an emotion that immediately connects with people and produces this kind of reaction. Look at this commercial. It's a British commercial that tells the same story as this poem in a completely different way.
Dad, what are you doing? I can't come home tonight. But what about football? I'm not going to be around anymore, so... When you coming back? I'm sorry. I don't understand. Look after your mum. Dad. Bye, Ben. Dad. Ben? Can you come with me, please?
You see the same story of the poem by Gianni Pascoli, but told in a different way and on a film. So why is a story the most powerful weapon for humans? Just summarizing what we already said in the first few minutes, in the first 10 minutes or so, the first reason why stories are so important is because they are not tales, but they are strategies for humans. And why they are strategies? Human need to survive. I mean, the first need of every human being is to survive. And to survive, you need to imagine outcomes that haven't yet come true. In another way, to survive, you have to be able to have strategies in place for every specific situation you are facing. And this is where stories come in. Imagine that in the days before humans got the ability of telling stories, the only way people had to learn something was actually to live the situation. So imagine that to survive an attack of a lion, those men and women 70,000 years ago, to learn how to escape, they had no other choice but to live the experience and survive. When people began telling stories, what happened? That you could learn, they could learn how to escape the attack of a lion from the experience of somebody else. And basically for the people who had been able to survive a lion attack. So stories are a strategy in the sense that people, when they face a situation, they go, their brain go and try to find strategies based on their experiences, but also based on stories they have been told. So that's why stories are strategies, and that's why brains need to consume as much story, are willing to consume as much stories as possible, because brain know that stories are a weapon to survive. The second thing that stories align emotion and reason, heart and mind. And the reason for that is that basically the emotions, the emotional part of the brain hijacks the rational part of the brain and take control and make decisions. It doesn't happen in the other way. So if you are able to influence the emotional part of the brain, you take control also of the rational part. But if you use data and you try to influence the rational part, that part is not able to influence the emotional part of the brain. Stories, as we have seen talking about Greece, unite people around the common cause, about, religions, political parties. They know that stories are the only way of creating large communities. And stories have the advantage versus traditional marketing strategy is that they don't go out to capture butterflies, but they create gardens for them to come. As I mentioned 2 minutes ago, the brains of people know that they have to consume as many stories as possible in order to survive. So they crave stories. They want to consume stories. They want to watch movies. They want to read books. They want to listen to people telling stories. So if you tell a powerful story, people will come. You will not need to go out and fight for them to catch them. Story also replace traditional tools. Most of the tools in marketing and also in the business world are based on technology of the 60s, when neuroscience thought that the decision-making was based in the rational part of the brain, while we know now that's not the case. So that most of the traditional tools are not working very well because they are based on a lie or a false information. And the last thing is that I think it's extremely important to remember the story are a bulwark against the persistent temptation to surrender to the logical numbers. Nowadays, Most companies are very focused on numbers, and that's important. But you cannot forget that you are dealing with people. And if you want to deal with people, you need to tell them stories and understand their stories. So otherwise, you will never go to achieve your goal. So the story are a powerful tool against the dictatorship of data. So what is a story? I mean, now we said the stories are extremely important, but what's a story? Stories are have certain elements that have been used by every storyteller from Homer to Spielberg and before that. We have, and I'll give you an example of why we need to understand those elements. In the north of France, there is a city called Amiens, where there is the largest Gothic cathedrals in France, or one of the largest. Before that, before the 14th century, most of the cathedrals in Europe were made in the Romanesque style. And the Romanesque style was dark, large walls, big columns, and responded very well to the story that the medieval story of the church, which was a story based on penance, sacrifice, fears, that kind of things. But suddenly in Florence, due to the emergence of the Renaissance, a new ideological current began to take hold, and that put the man in the center of the narrative and promote a new kind of story. So the church had to tell a different story, less dark, less oppressive. So they needed to tell stories full of light, very inspirational and happy. But the problem was that if you build a cathedral 70 meters to 250 feet high, with no walls and no columns, have a perverse tendency of falling down. So the architects had to find solution, and the solution were basically the cruise vault, the pointed arches, and the flying buttress. With those elements, architects were able to build huge cathedrals to tell the new story of a church starting in the 13th or 14th century. We have the same problem when we build a story. We need to find these architectural elements that let us support the story in a way that it never falls. So let's talk briefly of a couple of these elements. The first two basically are archetypes and plots. To explain briefly what they are, let us take two of the most famous stories ever told, David and Goliath and Romeo and Juliet. The archetype of the main character of David and Goliath is the archetype is a hero. The main character embodies the archetype of the hero. While in Romeo and Juliet, they embody the archetype of the lovers. But the archetypes themselves are not enough to describe what the story is about. You need another element, which is the plot. In the case of David and Goliath, the plot is overcoming the monster. And in the case of Romeo and Juliet, the plot is called Forbidden Love. So everything becomes to make sense. David and Goliath is a story of a hero that is trying to overcome a monster. And Romeo and Juliet is a story of two lovers who are fighting, living in a situation in which they have a forbidden love. So let's talk briefly about these two elements. The archetypes are static. They define who you are. And the plots are dynamic. They tell where you or the hero of the story goes. Archetypes, when I was studying in high school, I was studying Greek, and during the week I was reading the Iliad and the story of Achilles. Achilles, as you remember, was son of Titus and Peleus. Titus was a sea goddess, and when Achilles was born, she tried to make him immortal by dipping him into the water of the river Styx. The problem, however, is that she left invulnerable a little part of the body of Achilles, which was the part by which she held. And the left heel of the baby was the only part of his body vulnerable. So that was during the weekend. During the weekend, my father bought me some comic books, and one of my favorite heroes was Superman. And I immediately realized that Achilles and Superman are the same character. Now, they are superheroes, they are brave, but they have a vulnerability. For Achilles is the heel, and for Superman is kryptonite. So they have basically the same archetype. But when you dig a little deeper, you find out that they are different. Achilles is angry, vindictive, choleric, while Superman is not. So even if they share the first archetype, which is the vulnerable hero, they need some other archetypes to define them completely. That's why when we work with our clients, we help them to find the main archetype of their brand, of their company. But we need them also to find secondary and tertiary archetype that make them be more specifically them and not be confused with the other companies in the category. The same thing happens with Robin Hood and El Zorro. I mean, at the first sight, they seem pretty similar, but when you look a little deeper, you find out that El Zorro goes with a mask, he's an elitist, he has a beautiful horse, while Robin Hood doesn't have a horse, he rides a donkey, and he goes with an uncovered face. They share the first archetype, which is the defender of weak people or poor people, but then you need some other archetype to define them. What happens is that people are very good in reading archetypes. We have been doing that for thousands of years. So when we see a movie or we met a person, we immediately detect which is the archetype of this person or the archetype of a brand, a country, a city, or whatever it is. Humans have in their brain a little boxes. We work with 256 different archetypes, and people have 250 something little boxes. So if your brand or your organization uses archetypes, one of these 250 archetypes, people immediately will detect who they are. If you try to invent a different kind of personality, people will not be able to define who you are and probably would discard you. As I mentioned, we use 250 archetypes, and this is a chart we used recently for one of our clients. And of course, you don't need all of them because some are negative, some are female archetypes, but you have a completely spectrum of 250 archetypes. We do the same thing normally twice or three times. First, we try to define what the archetype of a brand or the company are, or the main and several other archetypes are. And then we do the same thing with the audiences. We try to define what the archetype of our audiences, our employees, our consumers, our clients, whatever it is, because the story of the organization and the story of the stakeholder, in a way or another, have to talk to each other, have to be compatible. Now I show you just one example because we don't have much time. Actually, I'm going a little too slow. An example of one brand that uses the archetype of the Cupid. The Cupid is an archetype that produces love, produces connection. And it is not only a romantic connection, it's a connection between people. It could be the love between a father and a daughter, love between two friends, but a Cupid put people together, joined people. Look at this example.
Sometimes the little things last the longest. Give extra, get extra.
You see, the brand plays the archetype of the Cupid not only as a brand, but also the product. The gum is a Cupid. The father uses it to connect with his daughter when she's sad or when she cries. But also the wrap, the little piece of paper that you usually threw away, becomes a Cupid. Is the element that connects father and daughter. So this is a clear example of how you can use an archetype at every level. I mean, from the brand to the products and even to the wrapping. Of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, you need to do the same process with the audiences. And this is an example of a brand that uses talk to an audience and recognize in the audience the archetype of the achiever. I mean, this brand talks to the achievers.
Molly, can you please take out the trash?
Molly, it's time to go. Class, let's turn to page 136, recessive traits shift generation.
I reprogrammed the robots to do the inspection. It's running much faster now. See?
It's amazing, Molly.
Thank you.
So the second element, as we mentioned before, is the plot. As you remember, as the archetype defines who you are, your company, your brand, your organization is, plots, that's where you are going. While we have, as I said before, 250 archetypes, we only have 30 plots, meaning that all movies, books, poems you have read or watched can be categorized in one of these 30 plots. I give you a couple of examples because we don't have much time. of how companies use these plots. The first one, first let me just talk about the most ancient plot of all. It's called Overcoming the Monster, which is the plot that is used for Casablanca, James Bond movies, Star Wars movies, Superman movies, Alien movies, Jurassic Park, etc. But also for the show, TV show House. Of course, if you watch closely, the story in House and in James Bond is the same one. It's the same story. The character, the archetypes are different, but the story is the same one. Is somebody fighting against something to save somebody else. So that's the universality of the plots. Are used once, again and again for centuries. And they allow you to tell many different kinds of stories, but with the same structure. Let's see a couple of examples of company who do that. The first one is Johnny Walker, and they use a plot called Quest. Quest is a story of a company or a character who embarks on a journey toward a goal, an objective. That can be very far away, but it's worth it. It's a very challenging, very demanding plot, because it means that you never get there. I mean, it's a very demanding story, a hero who fights and fights and fights to get to the top of the mountain. Look at this example.
Says it right there on the bottle. Johnny Walker Black Label, aged 12 years. Building character every step of the way. Think all the way back then. Think about how far you've come. Think about all the people that you didn't even know. People you've lost. People you've loved. Think about where you've been. The choices that you've made. Maybe you weren't always sure where you were going, but you made it here. Right here to this very moment. You took what came your way and you made it work. 12 years. Likely a bit wiser. Likely some regrets. But progress, no doubt. And so here we are. Ready for the next 12?
You know, this is the quest. Ready for the next 12. I mean, you never get there. I mean, it's a long journey in order to achieve a meaningful goal. Plots, as I mentioned, we use 30. We have divided them into several families, and can be, as well as the archetype, can be combined. You don't need just one, you probably need two, and sometimes you need three to tell a very compelling story. And I give again an example. If you watch Casablanca, of course, the main plot is overcoming the monster. Because, of course, I mean, there is a war situation, the Nazis. I mean, it's an oppressive situation in the middle of the war, but it is also a romance. It is also a discovery story of a hero who discovers who he really is. So several plots can be combined to tell a story in a movie or a story of the band. The very last element is the metaphor. The metaphor helps people to visualize things, to visualize complex things, boring concepts. Of course, we all use metaphors all day. For instance, we all say, Uncle Paul is the black sheep of the family. I mean, of course, he's not the black and he's not the sheep, but the metaphor is clear. When we say times is money, it's a metaphor. I give you an example. For instance, there is a company in the US called Carvana. It sells second-hand cars, used cars. And the idea of the mission is to change the way people buy cars. And they want to remove, that bad traditional dealership experience and replacing it with something new. So they used a metaphor. I mean, their buildings are like vending machines. Vending machines are a symbol of a different way of buying things. You don't have to deal with a seller. You just put the money, you click a couple of numbers, and you get the product you want. So the metaphor helps you tell the whole story just with a symbol. And I would like also to use a metaphor to explain why these three elements, archetypes, plots, and metaphors, can be intelligently combined to produce millions of combinations. Colors, colors in every culture are used to communicate emotions. The common idea is that colors generate specific emotions. Red has a meaning, blue is another meaning, green is another meaning, and this meaning can change according to the cultures. This is an example of the festival in India called Holi. And of course, people threw colored dust or colored water. And at the end of the day, everybody is completely full of colors all the day. So the human eye is in principle able to detect 1 million colors, a lot of colors. But nevertheless, a good painter with probably 10 to 12 little tubes is able to produce every color he wants, mixing them properly. We have to do the same thing with the elements we have seen in a moment ago, mixing 256 archetypes with 256 archetypes with 30 plots and 30 plots, you have millions of combinations, and you can create a colorful story that nobody else has. Know your competitors, know the other companies in the same category. You are completely different. For instance, if you mix just 2 archetypes and 2 plots, you have almost 60 million combinations. So it's pretty efficient, the system. I skip this because we don't have much time. We are almost 10 minutes away. These are the hidden elements, the one we're seeing are elements that we have to combine to do what? Why we need to combine archetype and plots and metaphor? To do what? To create the visible elements of a story. To create what people see, And to simplify a little bit, a story composed of several elements. There is a hero, your brand or company. The hero has a passion and has some antagonists. So the hero, to be a really hero, to be interesting, needs to have some passions and some antagonists. Then you need 3 more elements: a call to action, transformation, and victory. So first of all, of course, you need to define who your company is or your brand is. And you do it, as we mentioned, you define the passion, the higher purpose, the why, the archetype, the plot. You need to define perfectly well what your company stands for and who it is. Then you have the call to action, which is basically the reason why you need to tell a story. And that could be commoditization, that you realize that your product or services are not differentiated by your clients, so become invisible. Or perhaps you are not able to get a higher share of market. Or perhaps a competitor just invented a new product that makes you obsolete, there is always a call to action that requires you to tell a new story. But for that story to be impactful, this story had to produce two effects. It has to produce a transformation in people who listen to your story and define what means to win. The transformation basically is a journey to which the brand invites its audiences. And when we're talking about audience, I'm talking about your employees, your partners, your investors, your board members, your friends, your family, and of course, your clients and your consumers. You need to tell a transformational story. You need to tell a story that make them transform into a higher status, into a better way of living. Only a brand that tells a story to a consumer, a story that makes this consumer feel that using the service or product can improve his life. Only in that case the brand is winning. All stories are transformations. I mean, if you look at Pinocchio, Beauty and the Beast, and Cinderella, they are transformation to a higher status. In Pinocchio, a toy becomes a real kid, and Beauty and the Beast become a prince, and in Cinderella, she becomes a princess. So you need to be able to tell who you are, what your reason, why you are telling the story, and what transformation and victory you are proposing. So to achieve this, you need a methodology. And we have one, but anybody can use its own methodology, providing that you follow certain steps. Of course, all organizations, large and small, need a story. You know, if you're a large company and you're investing huge amount of money in advertising, and then you do a research or a post-testing to track the effectiveness of the campaign, and you try to monitor the performance of a brand after you spend several $1 million in a campaign, you very often find out that the campaign didn't perform very well. And in some cases, you haven't discovered that your campaign has helped your competitors to sell their products because your campaign was designed to promote a category, not your specific brand. And if you are a leader of a very small company, and probably you don't have a powerful marketing department, and you don't have a huge advertising agency, and you don't have deep pockets to buy commercials, to produce commercials and put them on there, you need a better story, because only a better story can go through, the filters that people have and can engage them to your brand. There are 3 steps that we recommend to follow. The first one is listening. Before you tell a story, you have to listen. You have to listen to people, your employees, your partners, your consumer, to understand what they desire, what their needs are, what their dreams are, what they want, and to understand their personal lives, what their personal life, because that's the only way to understand what story you can tell. Why? Because, as we will see in a moment, emotions are the key of a story. You need to produce emotion in your audiences. The second step is to find the building blocks of a story. In the second phase, you don't tell the story yet. You just find the building blocks, the elements that allow you to tell the story. And these are basically the elements we have seen before, and they are designed with one function: to impulse the positive emotions in all your audiences, your employees or your consumers, and fight against the negative emotions that people can have. So only if your brand or your company can help people to overcome negative emotions and overpower good emotion, only in that case your brand is going to be successful. And the very last element is to combine these elements into different executions. Think that a story is not a commercial, is not an email, is not an ad on a newspaper. The story is a combination of all of those stuff. So you need to be able to produce many different pieces of storytelling. Nevertheless, all these pieces have to be coordinated. They all have to be built using the same building blocks, same archetypes, the same plot, the same emotions, the same metaphors. And I would like to close because I'm really very late, unfortunately. I would like to finish with a line by Eduardo Galeano. It says, scientists say that human beings are made of atoms, but a little bird told me that we are also made of stories. Okay, thank you so very much for listening to me. It was a pleasure talking to you. I hope that this conversation be useful. If you need any additional information, please send an email to Executive Forum. They will pass it to me. I will be happy to answer. Thank you so very much indeed.